Andy.
Hi. Okay.
Hi.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So my name is Andy Goldring, and I'm calling in from the UK, from the north of England, a city called Leeds. And I'm the Chief Executive of the Permaculture Association, which is the national charity that works in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland and England, and works to support more people to be able to do more permaculture. So for the last 30 years, we've been helping people to learn about and use permaculture in their homes, gardens, small holdings, farms, schools and businesses. And today I want to say a little bit more about permaculture and its application to agriculture, and answer some of the questions that I was given in advance for people that have come to this conference. Thank you to the organisers. This is really fantastic to know that this is happening, and giving so much attention to sustainable agriculture, which is such a critical issue. I learned a huge amount from Ramona's talk just before me. I thought that was a fantastic talk, and thank you so much for that, Ramona. I think I can say that permaculture is very much aligned with everything that you've said, and stands in solidarity with Via Campesina and the small farmers and producers around the world in groups like Eco Ruralis and in many other groups. So we feel very much connected and in support of that work. And I think Ramona said that there are something like 600 million family farms, small farms around the world, and more than a half of the world's labour force is engaged in agriculture. So yeah, more than half the workers in the world are in agriculture, and mostly some of the poorest people in the world. So there's a real challenge, which is how to support people to meet more of their needs in a more sustainable way, and in a more, with more, just improve people's livelihoods and their quality of life. But also we have a huge problem in agriculture, which is that, as the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment told us in 2000, industrial agriculture is the most destructive human activity. So industrial farming is causing climate change, massive losses of soil and biodiversity, and poisoning much of our water and our food, which is leading to huge health consequences. So on one hand, we have industrial agriculture, which is causing huge problems, and then on another hand, we have small-scale farming, which isn't valued highly enough and means that many people live in poverty. So farming is a really big issue, and it's great that this conference is addressing that work, important work. So I want to share a few slides, and I'm just going to speak briefly about permaculture, because I'm aware that not everybody will have come across permaculture before. So let me just share my screen and get my presentation in place. Okay. So I guess the thing to start off with is that permaculture was born in Australia in about in the early 1970s, and it first came about in this book, Permaculture 1, in 1978, quickly by Permaculture 2 in 1979. So this was its beginning, and it started as, the phrase is, a perennial agriculture for human settlements. And I think that's a very important starting point. So permaculture built on work by other people, suggesting that we should shift from a primarily annual-based agriculture to a perennial-based agriculture. So shifting from an emphasis on grains and annual crops through to more emphasis on trees and other perennial plants. Not getting rid of the cereals and not getting rid of the vegetables, but complementing them within a more perennial agricultural framework. But permaculture also drew on influences of self-sufficiency, the environment movement, ecology, indigenous wisdom, traditional practices. And one of the things that David Holmgren said, which I think is important, is that it was this idea of how could you combine agriculture with lessons from ecology with the idea of landscape design. So we're moving into sort of this design approach. And I guess that design aspect grew, and a few years after the first books which emphasized a perennial agriculture, the designer's manual came out, and the shift started to be more towards the design of agricultural systems. And then by the 2000s, David Holmgren had put out this book, The Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, where ultimately permaculture is seen as a systems thinking approach to everything, to housing, to community, to education, to all the different aspects of human life. So permaculture grew from this agricultural base into a design approach, systems thinking for everything. And I think that evolution is helpful. Design is a very useful, transferable skill, but we mustn't lose our roots in agriculture and in this really important approach to a perennial agriculture. So, as I say, permaculture has this holistic framework. We draw together an ethical framework of earth care, people care, and fair shares. We draw lessons from nature because nature works so well, and we integrate that with some design tools and processes. And that helps us to think in an holistic way, in an integrated way that brings together these different approaches. So a permaculture farm is a farm, but it's also thinking about how the farm integrates with the buildings, the use of appropriate tools and technology, how it might work from an education and culture perspective, how it can become a space for health and spiritual well-being, how the finances and economics can be used in a way which generates income for the farmers, but also for the community, and how it can be managed in a way which means that the stewardship of the land is long-term. So I won't say too much more about the ethical foundations, other than, I guess, earth care, people care, fair shares is easy to remember, and it's very powerful. It motivates people all around the world to do what they're doing. Yeah, and I think the lessons from nature is an important point to make here, because ultimately farming depends on nature. It depends on soil, it depends on biodiversity, it depends on the living world and its interaction with the sun and the climate to produce our food. And permaculture is saying, let's work with nature. And this is what is now called agroecology. So agroecology is the study and the practice and the politics of farming systems that are working with nature. So permaculture is very much in that agroecological framework and perspective, because nature works brilliantly. It's absolutely fantastic. And we, as it says here, we have 3.5 billion years of research and development that we can learn from and draw on. So permaculture is looking at how do natural systems work and how can we incorporate that into our farming and into our human cultures. And we've converted kind of ecological principles into a series of phrases and slogans and principles that help people to use them in everyday life. So that might be use small and slow solutions, or use and value diversity, or produce no waste. These are all ways of helping us to ask good questions and for those good questions to help us to develop sort of systems thinking. So thinking broadly and holistically. And the final thing to say about this sort of permaculture framework is we have the guiding ethics and values. We're inspired by nature, but then the way we make things happen is through this design approach. And many of those design tools are borrowed from other places. So they are, from engineering or from geography or from, other disciplines. And there are a few that we have developed ourselves, most notably things like zones and sectors, which I won't go into now. And we have a process or processes that we use, like SADIMET, so survey, analyze, design, implement, and so on. So this design approach means that we can work together in a very collaborative way. And it means we're always looking to see how we can improve the system. So one of the things about permaculture, smallholdings and farms is that they're constantly evolving. We're always looking to see how we can add more value for nature, more value for humans in the farm system. And that's a design approach. So when it comes to permaculture for sustainable agriculture, there are a growing number of really excellent examples of how permaculture design thinking has been applied to small holdings and farms. The most advanced systems are in Australia, because that's where permaculture started. And so they've had the longest amount of time to practice. But they're also more in Australia than in the UK, because access to land has been easier in Australia. So although the UK learned about permaculture in the early 80s and has been going since then, it's taken us a lot longer to develop farm scale permaculture, because access to land in the UK is very, very difficult. We have some of the most concentrated land ownership in the world. I think the only country, well, certainly Brazil has the most concentrated land ownership, and we're second or third on the list. So a very small number of people own most of the land in the UK. And that means that it's very hard to access. We're finding very creative ways to access land now. And some of the existing landowners are starting to adopt permaculture, but I think it's really taken us quite some time to develop at a farm scale. Having said that, that's meant that we've, I think, done a lot of innovation in small scale farming, community supported agriculture, and smaller holdings, which is also very useful. A short case study here, I think, that I want to share is of the Apricot Centre, which is a relatively new farm in Devon, run by Marina O'Connell and her team. And they managed to buy the land, or they have a tenancy, so they rent the land, but the land was bought by the Biodynamic Land Trust through a public subscription process. So many people put money in, and collectively they own the land through the Biodynamic Land Trust, who have given the Apricot Centre a 25-year lease with an option to renew. So the land has now been brought into kind of shared ownership, and Marina used a permaculture design approach to assess the land, survey, understand the soil, the biodiversity, the topography, the hydrology. And through that permaculture design approach, then started to bring in a series of techniques and other approaches and combined them into the design for the whole site. And the approaches that she's used most importantly are agroforestry, so combining tree crops and annual crops in this case, biodynamics, in particular the sort of soil preparations and the ways that they have added effectively like liquid composts to the land, and principles of organic agriculture. So she's drawn from other disciplines and other approaches and combined them into a design for her site. And one of the things that they did at the beginning of the process was to do a baseline survey. So what is the quality of our soil? What is the quality of our biodiversity? What is the quality of our income? And 5 years later, they've had an independent report and their soil fertility has gone shot up. Their soil carbon has gone right up. The biodiversity has increased enormously. And they are just within 5 years of this new farm, they're now turning really quite a good income from the land. And it's a really fantastic result. The soil quality in particular shows really very dramatic increases, in particular of soil carbon, which with climate change is a huge issue. How farmers can sequester carbon on their land is really critical. So all the signs are that it's working very, very well. And I guess one of the things I wanted to say about the farm, which is important, is that I question whether we could even call it a farm. I think we might need a new word, because yes, it's a farm and they do produce many different crops. It's a polyculture. They have a wide range of annual crops which are sold at the local farmers market through a box scheme and in other ways. But it's also an education centre. So they run courses for adults. They run forest schools for children and young people. So it's also a school. It's a community centre. So they have parties and events and community building activities and skills building. So it's a community centre. They also run therapeutic sessions for troubled teenagers and young people. So people that are struggling with their mental health. So it's also a healing space. And I think that approach to farming is so vital, that farms fulfill many different functions in a community, and a good permaculture design tries to draw that out and make sure that the farm is a place where people can thrive and nature can thrive, as well as the crops. So we get good crops, but we also get good results for people and other species. And in English, we have a phrase that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So I guess, seeing is believing. If it works, people will want to do more of it. And Marina and Bob and Rachel, the three main lead people at the farm, are now basically struggling to keep up with demand for consultations from other farmers and landowners. So they have seen what has happened when you combine permaculture, agroforestry, biodynamics, and organic agriculture. The report speaks for itself. It's very powerful, and other people want to do that. And so it's spreading. Other farms are taking on permaculture ideas and seeing how we can integrate agroecological methods and community-supported agriculture approaches to change the way that farming works. So the Apricot Centre is about 30 hectares, I think. In the UK, typically, permaculture holdings might be anywhere between 3 hectares to 15 hectares, typically quite small. But increasingly, there are holdings of about 50 hectares, and they're going up now. So yeah, on average, they are smaller, but I think it's getting bigger. And in many ways, it's not a competition to get bigger. It's just interesting that it can do so. And I think the next speaker, Hannah Thorogood from the Inkpot farm, will be able to tell you how she's gone from about 7 hectares up to about 45 hectares. We usually work in acres, and I don't know if that translates, but it's something of that scale. And when it comes to scale, I think it's a question later, but just to say here that permaculture can scale really to any situation. So people are using permaculture to think about how they work with a whole watershed. So some of my colleagues in Africa are looking at how the whole watershed, the whole valley works from a design perspective. How can they intervene with that watershed? So that's big. All the way down to what you do in your back garden. So the design methods and the principles can be applied at any scale, but the techniques and approaches that you apply will be dependent on the scale that you're working. So just to give briefly a snapshot of what else is happening, there are many good examples, and I don't know enough about them. If I'd had a bit longer to research this for this conference, I would have created a better list maybe, but it makes me really realize, I mean, the last point here is that research is needed to bring together this work. I think we don't quite yet know how much is happening at a farm scale with permaculture, and what the case studies tell us about what the future of farming could look like. So much more research is needed. But to give you a flavor of some of the things that are happening, I know that in Germany, there's a supermarket chain who is now actively working with permaculture growers to supply local and organic food for their supermarkets. So each local supermarket supplied locally by permaculture holdings. Now, we might question whether supermarkets are the right way forward, but nonetheless, I think that's an indicator that permaculture is being taken more seriously and is starting to produce quite significant amounts of food. In France, Le Bec Halloween is a very well studied project. So the image you can see there is of the farm Bec Halloween in France. It's a very small site, and yet on that very small site, they make more income than an average farmer does on 50 times more land. Their reports show a phenomenal amount of productivity. So it's very intensively managed, and they crop multiple times each year. They have some very intensive methods in terms of their polytunnels, so some controlled growing, but all agroecological, no use of chemicals, and serving a local market. And it's a glimpse into the future, really, I think, from Bec Halloween, because it just shows that, as Ramona was saying earlier, that small-scale farming is enormously productive. And I think we can complement traditional small-scale farming and add some new ideas and some new research from permaculture and from other places, and we can become even more productive, which is a critical issue, because one of the goals of permaculture is to meet our needs on less land, so that we can give more land back to nature to be wild. Because nature and where land is wild, or where land is managed by indigenous people, there's more biodiversity. So if we want a flourishing biodiversity all around the world, more nature, then we need to give more land to nature and more land back to the stewardship of indigenous people. And in order to do that, we need to meet our needs in less land. So these farms that produce so much in a small space are really important. Other great examples are people like Richard Perkins in Sweden, or Matt Swarbrick in Wales. Matt is doing a similar kind of project, integrating to the Apricot Centre, so integrating education and community supported agriculture. And he's now working with a group called Farming Connect in Wales, which is a government scheme to spread good ideas. So Matt is being supported by the government to talk to other farmers about what he's doing with permaculture and with regenerative agriculture more generally. And there are many community supported agriculture schemes and small holdings doing similar things in the UK. So that's a really flourishing area, is that community supported agriculture, 5 to 10 hectare at the most. No, actually up to 5 hectares in many cases. So small holdings, really engaged with the community, with perennial plants and tree crops and many kind of vegetable and essentially lots of vegetables. And then we have Darren Doherty's work on Regen Ag, which I think is important to name here, because Darren Doherty is an Australian who learns about permaculture and keyline planning and holistic management grazing, and was very inspired by permaculture and very inspired by the results that were happening, but felt very strongly that there was an image problem with permaculture for farmers, and that he felt it needed to be rebranded so that it was more accessible to an Australian farming community. So he came up with this brand called Regen Ag, regenerative agriculture. And it's been incredibly influential, because now regenerative agriculture as a buzzword is certainly in the UK, it's very widespread. Everyone's talking about regenerative agriculture, which is a brilliant idea. So regenerative means not just sustainable, not just staying the same, but actually regenerating and becoming healthier and more vital as time goes by. So it's very powerful. And one of the things that we need to say is that regenerative agriculture doesn't in itself have a definition or a particular process. It draws together different tools, much like permaculture did. So many regenerative agriculture projects are actually permaculture projects, but they're using regenerative agriculture as the heading because it's more accessible. So yeah, many examples that I can tell you about describe themselves publicly now as Regen Ag or regenerative agriculture projects. And the connection really is about a branding issue to make sure that it's accessible to farmers. So importantly, I think permaculture design methods and ecological principles is like the toolkit to help you create a regenerative farm. And so people like Ecosia, which is a search engine which you can add to your browser and use instead of Google. Ecosia, every time you do a search, it helps raise funds for tree planting. So very, very permaculture. They have a Regen Ag scheme for agriculture. And I was a judge for that competition, and so many different great examples from all across Europe of permaculture proposals for farming, which just gave me a sense that this is a really growing area. Yeah, do check out Ecosia, and they have some information about permaculture farms and regenerative agriculture. And I wanted to say as well that if you're not aware of it, the European Permaculture Convergence, which happened earlier this year, had 10 days of content, and day 8 was about farming with nature, and day 9 was about healing landscapes. So if you wanted to know more about some in-depth case studies, then check out eupc.community and look at day 8 and day 9. And we learned a lot in that event, actually, about what's going on around Europe. So there is more research, as I say, needed to bring this together. So I'll move now to some of the questions that were asked in advance and draw to a close. So the first question was the efficiency of permaculture. Is permaculture really only for small farms? So no, I think is the answer. Permaculture can be applied to many different scales, as I said previously. At different scales, you need to use different approaches and techniques. So the bigger you get, then it's going to be more like agroforestry and silvopasture, more forestry generally at a bigger scale. But also, I think it's not just about how the techniques of land management increase, it's also about how techniques of people management or self-management need to be adopted. So in a diverse farm system, in a polyculture, there are many different opportunities for livelihoods and incomes. And as a farm gets bigger, those opportunities increase. And so I think the key to growing the scale of farming is about cultivating the community of livelihoods, the community of workers, the community of people engaged in that space. So there's no reason in principle why we couldn't have large permaculture farms, but that would need a large community of permaculture farm workers doing many different things, healing activities, community building activities, educational activities, processing crops, value adding, restaurants, tours, many different nature trails, many different activities. So then the question is, how do we work together to manage land together in a productive way? And so to grow a farm, you also need to grow a community of people. I think there's also ethical questions about how much land anyone should be able to own. So for me, increasing the size of a farm is also a question of ownership and stewardship. So when we go beyond a small scale family farm into a bigger realm, that's when I think we need to be looking at community ownership, some of the work of the commons by people like Eleanor Ostrom. How do we then bring land into more of a role of collective stewardship for the long term rather than private ownership for personal profit? So I think as we scale up, we need to address issues of equity, fairness, and we're really into the realm of social design as much as the realm of physical design. I would say the physical design of the land is the easy bit, actually. There's lots of good examples of doing that. The most challenging area is the social design. So the second question was, can permaculture ensure food security? Yes, absolutely. As Ramona said earlier, small scale agroecological non-industrial farming already feeds, I had 70%, Ramona said 80%, let's say 75% of the world's food needs are already being met by small scale farming. So let's put that another way. Industrial agriculture, which makes all the noise, is only feeding a quarter of our needs, which is a really quite astonishing fact, especially from the UK, which has such a processed industrial food system. We forget that actually it's small scale farming is really feeding the world. So there's absolutely no question that permaculture approaches can support the already good work in many countries around the world by small-scale farmers. Oliver de Schutter, who was the United Nations Rapporteur on Food a number of years ago, did some work and was very confident that the most likely way to double food production in the next 50 years is agroecological methods. So if we want to secure our food supply in the long term, this is the area we need to focus on, supporting existing small-scale family farms and bringing in new agroecological techniques and permaculture design approaches to support the existing small-scale farmers. So another question is how to determine if a farm is permacultural. Could you give some criteria? So I think quite simply, we need to see whether or not the most important things are improving. And in a farm, the most important things are the soil, the quality of the water, the quality of the biodiversity, the quality and quantity of biodiversity, and the health of the whole system. So is the soil more fertile? Is the water clean, and is there enough water? Are there more birds and insects? Are the workers happy, and is the community engaged? If those 5 pieces are in place, I would say that a permaculture farm is successful. Good soil, good water, flourishing nature, happy workers, and a happy community. That has to be, the key to it. And actually, maybe the one other thing which would be bring a lot of that together is this idea of nutrient density. So how much nutrition is in the food itself? And there's some work on this at the moment in the UK with an initiative called Growing Food for Nutrition. And they use a bricks refractometer. So it's a tool where you can get some of the carrot or the apple, you take some of the apple and you squash it, put it into the bricks refractometer, and depending on the color and the light, it gives you a scale, and you can tell how much nutrient density is in the food. So industrially produced food tends to have very low nutrient density. So people eat, but they're not getting what they really need. For nutrient-dense food, it's giving you the minerals and the nutrients that you need. So it's much better for you. So we need to be producing more nutrient-dense food. And typically, organic, well-mineralized soils will produce more nutrient-dense food. So maybe that's the other criteria. So soil, water, biodiversity, happy workers, happy community, and nutrient-dense food. Obviously, that's a quite simple answer. And this is where we can work with other organizations and networks for more scientific approaches, maybe, or a more rigorous approach. And the Sustainable Food Trust have been developing sustainability metrics. And there's a link here which you can look up. If you look up Sustainable Food Trust sustainability metrics, you'll find the information there. That and other initiatives, I think, indicate a kind of holistic approach to understanding whether a farm is being successful. And Permaculture Association has contributed to those processes, so it does include our thinking. So just to draw to a close, are there different schools or trends of permaculture in the world? So a big question. I think I'd go back to my books. So for some people, permaculture is all about perennial agriculture, which is fantastic. It's a very important topic. For some people, permaculture is all about design. They're designers. And for some people, permaculture is all about everything. World change, make the world a better place. Earth care, people care, fair shares. So there are different approaches. People that are more interested in being farmers. Here we've got Richard Perkins' Permaculture Farm. That's very much about the integrated practice on the ground. But he also takes a design approach. For people like me, I'm an organizer. I spend more of my time building networks and helping to grow the movement. So for me, maybe I'm more in the world change category. But the key thing is that all of these people are needed. So if there are different trends or if there are different schools, we should go back to our own ecological principles and remember that we're all parts of an ecosystem, and that an ecosystem works because of the relationships between the different elements in the system. So for different tribes and for different schools, that's fantastic. That gives us diversity, and that gives us new relationships with each other that helps us to thrive overall. So yes, there are different schools. Yes, let's keep talking to each other and recognize those differences as strengths and as added value, which helps us to understand and negotiate an increasingly difficult world. And finally, in Belarus, people want to organize a permaculture center for the training and dissemination of permaculture. What advice can you give? I'd be very happy to talk in person at another point. We have a European Union Erasmus funded project called IACT, which is developing resources and guidance to do exactly that, to help people set up demonstration centres. So please, let's talk more. There are many examples in the Permaculture Association, and we have a map of projects that you can have a look at. But yes, I'd love to talk more about that, and maybe this could give me an excuse to visit Belarus, which would be wonderful. So there are some questions, some resources which I'll share in the chat after this talk. So I think I shall stop there, and I hope I'm not up too much over time. So thank you very much.